We left 2 endings open on the table this morning. Not because we had reached an especially elevated state of marriage, but because neither of us was willing to shut either book.
One of them has Lear carrying Cordelia's body. The other has him declare that Cordelia shall be queen, then imagine retirement with her and Kent in what Nahum Tate calls a cool cell.
You said Tate's ending at least lets you close the book without feeling that you have abandoned somebody.
I said it gives Lear and Cordelia somewhere to go after suffering. There is a difference.
Not enough difference for me to stop being suspicious. Because the immediate reply is always, yes, but that is the sentimental version. The serious reader chooses the dead daughter, the dead march, the ending that makes everyone feel dreadful and therefore very intelligent.
A social ritual with its own crown and scepter.
You do not rescue Cordelia. You prove that you are mature enough to endure her.
A strange contest in moral stamina.
But I do not think that is the real problem. Why does the original ending make rescue feel like a demand? And why did Tate have to change so much before rescue could become more than a hand reaching in at the last minute?
I am YY. Welcome to Critical Animal, a podcast about culture, ethics, history, and the lives of animals.
I am Bear. In our video essays, every argument begins with a specific story. But in a deep cut, we stay with the story until it gets uncomfortable. Then we should begin before Cordelia dies, before the storm, before the old king becomes an old body in the rain whom we want to take indoors.
We need to begin where an act of public distribution asks private attachment to speak its value.
And then we have to ask why later readers in theaters kept trying to repair the relations that act has forced together. Love, property, authority, survival, succession, justice.
This is not an episode about whether William Shakespeare was secretly against Aristotle. We cannot show that. It is not about whether Tate was cowardly or whether unhappy endings are automatically deeper.
The limits are part of the method.
It is about a harder thing. What does a tragedy make public feeling carry? And what has to be rebuilt before an ending can let that feeling go somewhere else? The familiar account of King Lear begins with Lear demanding flattery from 3 daughters. But the opening is also a public test with punishments attached. He divides land and rank, sets dowry and succession on the table, then strips Cordelia of all 3 when she refuses the speech he demands.
He announces that he will divide the kingdom into 3. He keeps the name of king, a retinue, and a residue of status. But he asks his daughters to make love speak publicly before land can be distributed.
Cordelia's first answer, nothing, is not merely a private refusal to play a humiliating family game. It has a material consequence. No dower, no share, no public place within the arrangement being made.
And she does not answer with a simple declaration of inner authenticity. She says she loves according to her bond. That word is doing much more than modern emotional vocabulary can hold. It means obligation. It means relation. It means a form of attachment that is already social and legal as well as intimate.
The fantasy of Cordelia's pure, private feeling needs care. Lear's demand is coercive. But Cordelia's answer is not outside the world of obligation. She refuses one public form of speech through another language of duty.
This is where the division becomes strange. It asks a daughter to turn a relation of obligation into measurable evidence. The proof of love must become something that can be compared, ranked, and translated into land.
And it happens before the play has made anybody poor, naked, mad, blind, or dead. The catastrophe begins with a structure of value. A father and sovereign make family speech answerable to public property.
The scene cannot be reduced to bad parenting. The problem is not merely that Lear has feelings. The problem is that he has made a governmental transaction depend upon a declaration of feelings.
Let me push you here. You always want to make the furniture, especially chairs, important.
Land is not furniture.
I know. But if we say territory and succession, listeners may think we have moved away from the humiliation of the scene. Lear is not calmly administering an estate. He is asking to be loved in a public language that he controls.
The material arrangement gives that demand a force it would not otherwise have. If he were only a father asking an embarrassing question at dinner, Cordelia could leave the room. Here, the answer changes her political and economic future.
Emotional violence and public transaction are not two separate plots. They are the same act. That is why later repairs are so difficult. They cannot simply fix a family feeling because the feeling has already been made to carry land, inheritance, and authority.
Lear also imagines that division will let him shed responsibility while preserving authority. He can give away the kingdom and retain the name, the company, the ceremonial residue of power. The play will keep testing whether one can divide those things so neatly.
The division is also staged as a competition. Goneril and Regan learn very quickly what the scene rewards. They produce speeches that convert affection into a kind of public surplus. Cordelia's answer refuses that market. But the market does not vanish because she has refused it.
And the older king mistakes performance for guarantee. The speeches do not create a stable order. They expose how fragile his arrangement already is. He needs the public declaration precisely because ordinary political obligation is no longer enough to reassure him.
I began by hearing a father's wounded vanity. You began by hearing a dynastic transaction. But I am not yet comfortable saying that bond solves the difference. It may bind Cordelia to a duty that gives Lear one more language in which to test her.
It may. But do not make duty merely another name for coercion. Her bond also limits Lear. It says love is already an obligation. It is not raw material for a competition he has invented.
Not raw material, yes. But it is still caught inside his arrangement. The same word that names relation becomes the language through which he can measure her answer and expel her.
Then I would revise my first claim. Bond names duty without innocence. It neither frees Cordelia from hierarchy nor lets Lear own the meaning of obligation.
The scene cannot be divided into private sincerity on one side and public corruption on the other. The obligation is real. So is the structure that seizes it.
A later repair has to confront more than a bad feeling. A public order that has made filial speech carry public property.
And it will keep producing terrible answers. Need will return. Exposure will return. Recognition will return. Justice will return. None will be able to untie what this first scene has tied together.
The question of Cordelia's death begins here. If her death is only a final cruelty, Tate can correct it by saving her. If it belongs to a world in which love has already become public evidence, inheritance, rank, and injury, then saving her will require a different causal world.
Not a different feeling, a different sequence of what can follow from a feeling. Goneril and Regan are not only wicked daughters waiting to reveal themselves, the opening gives them a language that works within Lear's arrangement. They can produce the lavish public speech he has demanded. Their later cruelty is not caused by eloquence, but the first scene has already taught everyone that speech can be rewarded with power.
Cordelia's disaster is therefore not the punishment for insufficient affection. It follows from a test that treats affection as a currency of public distribution. Her refusal reveals the test's violence. It does not stand outside the obligations it has damaged.
The scene remains uncomfortable. We want to defend Cordelia by saying she is sincere, but sincerity alone cannot answer what Lear has made love do. The question is how one speaks truth when truth has been forced to appear in a market of inheritance, titles, and favors.
And that question gives the episode its root. A later repair must decide whether it can change the distribution, the language, the evidence, or the ending. Tate will change more than one of them. Lear soon finds that keeping the name of king and 100 knights depends on the land, household, and obedience he has given away. His daughters begin reducing the followers who accompany him. The old king's argument becomes an argument about need.
O reason, not the need. It is one of those lines that can be made to sound very beautiful before we ask who is saying it.
He protests that if we measure people only by bare necessity, human life becomes cheap as a beast's. Clothes, ceremony, company, the things that appear excessive, these are part of what makes life human rather than merely biological.
The claim is serious. We know its domestic form. A room with a door that shuts so a person can sleep, grieve, read, or refuse intrusion.
And none of this is a small metaphor for Lear's knights.
A coat that does more than prevent hypothermia, because it lets someone walk outside without exposure. The companion who makes a journey possible after the body has become uncertain. These are not ornaments added after life itself.
Who gets to define enough matters.
To say that a person can technically survive without them is to define life at its lowest possible threshold.
Survival is a floor, not an account of a life.
Lear's 100 knights are not a modest domestic need. But his excess makes visible a terrible question. When does "you can do without it" become a way of stripping someone of the form in which they can still appear to themselves and others as a person?
But Lear is not a neutral witness for that claim. He is a man who has lived through surplus as power. His retinue is not just a blanket and a good chair. It is the visible continuation of his former rule.
The scene gives us a problem rather than a lesson. If we dismiss Lear, we make Mead mean bare survival. If we accept everything he says, we risk treating former sovereignty as the measure of human dignity.
Bare survival cannot define dignity. Former sovereignty cannot define it either. The play refuses to settle that problem at once. It lets Lear see something true about the indignity of reducing life to minimum provision. It also lets us see that he has only discovered this truth after other people have made his own excess negotiable.
This matters for the rest of the episode because need looks like a possible repair. Perhaps the play's politics can be corrected by returning to basic human necessity. Feed people. Shelter them. Stop pretending that affection can be calculated in land.
But the scene will not allow us to stop there. The language of need is necessary. It is not enough.
And I think that is one of the things that makes Lear difficult to repair. Every time the play offers a word that sounds humane, need, shelter, humanity, it turns out to be carrying an argument it cannot complete alone.
The scene changes the relation between quantity and humiliation. The daughters can argue numbers. Lear cannot answer only with numbers because what is being taken away is his capacity to appear as the person he has been. That capacity was always supported by servants, objects, space, and other people's recognition.
Which does not make his demand innocent. It makes the scene more difficult than a moral about luxury. His former privilege has taught him something grotesque about excess. His dispossession teaches him something true about the violence of asking a person to survive at the minimum.
Lear gives the consequence its sharpest form. Allow not nature more than nature needs. Man's life is cheap as beasts. The play lets both recognitions stand. It does not reward us with a clean observer who sees the moral of need without being implicated in the arrangement that has produced it.
Once love, care, rank, and survival have been made mutually answerable, rescue cannot be just a feeling. It has to be a sequence of material acts that arrive soon enough. At this point, even our dogs could reasonably ask why we have spent so much time before Cordelia's death. Everyone knows the ending. Why not begin with the body and decide whether Tate was kinder? In the version of heaven our dogs prefer, Cordelia is already there, alive, and waiting for us to stop explaining. But that is exactly the shortcut that would make Cordelia's death into a single event floating above the action. The original play has spent hours teaching us what rescue would have to overcome.
A rescue late in Scene 5 cannot carry everything.
Love has been made into evidence. Need has been made inseparable from rank. Exposure has become a scene of misreading. Recognition may arrive after the conditions for action have already vanished. To save Cordelia is therefore not simply to give a good person more luck. It is to make a world in which private feeling can become public knowledge. Public knowledge can become timely action, and timely action can produce something other than another delayed recognition.
At the end, delayed recognition gets a name. Mortally wounded, Edmund says, "Some good I mean to do," and reveals that his writ is on the life of Lear and on Cordelia.
Then the play gives us confusion, not coordination. Albany cries, "Run! Run! Oh, run!" Edgar asks, "Who has the office?" The reprieve needs a token. The sword must reach the captain. By the time the messenger returns, Edgar calls it very bootless.
The knowledge is real. The order is still too slow. We are not choosing mercy over cruelty. It is what institutions, relations, and forms of attention have to exist before mercy can act.
Let me make the objection for you. If Tate gets the message there in time, have we changed in ethics? Or have we only made causality more consoling?
I would not call it only consolation. A letter arriving, a captain being reached, a person being believed. Those are not decorative plot devices. They are conditions under which care can become an act.
But Shakespeare has just shown us how much depends on them. I do not want Tate to become a manual for saying that better logistics settle moral disaster.
Nor do I. The question opens rather than closes. Tate gives us a world in which mercy has a route. It does not prove that every world can supply one.
Then his adaptation is not a lesson in optimistic causality. It is a counterworld that makes us ask what the original has made impossible.
And now we can return to the storm without treating it as weather between one family scene and one catastrophe. It is part of the long test of what, in this world, can actually become help.
Then the storm arrives, and with it, the temptation to find a human truth underneath everything social. Lear sees poor Tom and begins imagining what a person is when stripped of accommodation, clothing, status, and property.
Unaccommodated man, as a poor, bare-forked animal.
I confess that I want this to be a powerful moment, a clean human truth after all the courtly noise. That is precisely why it is a trap. Poor Tom is Edgar's disguise. Exposure here is staged. Poverty is performed under duress. The body Lear thinks he is reading transparently is part of a survival strategy.
That does not make the suffering unreal. It means the scene will not let suffering become innocent evidence. Clothing, nakedness, animality, madness, all arrive through social forms and theatrical forms.
I become impatient when this scene is made into a little poster about stripping off civilization and discovering our true humanity. Edgar has put on a role. Lear misreads it. The audience knows something Lear does not. There is no clean point at which the play gives us humanity before mediation.
The audience's knowledge is crucial. We watch Lear's compassion become possible through a mistake. He sees a suffering body and reaches toward a truth about accommodation. But the body has been arranged as a sign by someone trying to survive.
The scene does not say that sympathy is false. It says that sympathy takes place inside costumes, histories of poverty, and acts of reading that can go wrong. That is harder work than declaring that we have discovered the human beneath society.
It also puts Gloucester nearby, moving through his own catastrophe. The play makes blindness, exposure, filial betrayal, and bodily vulnerability proliferate across different plots. No one scene can carry the full diagnosis.
The Gloucester story repeats Lear's disaster differently. Another father, another child cast out, another person forced to depend upon an untrustworthy world. The suffering does not gather neatly because it keeps finding another body through which to appear.
Still, Lear's mistake changes him. He has been forced to see that the social things he took as his natural due, shelter, attendance, order, clothes, are arrangements. That recognition does not save anyone, but it alters the scale of what he can perceive.
The play does not give us a stable human essence. It gives us an exposed encounter that is at once theatrical, deceptive, miserable, and ethically consequential.
The distinction matters for Tate later. If exposure itself revealed a final truth, an adaptation would only need to preserve the storm and add a kinder ending. But the original has made exposure a complicated scene of misrecognition. A repair must decide what to do with that complication.
And Tate does decide. He gives the action more routes by which knowledge can become help. But before we arrive there, we need to see what happens when recognition itself finally comes. At the end, Lear carries Cordelia's body on stage. He asks why a dog, a horse, a rat should have life when she has none.
The question has no answer that punishment can solve. The villains are dying or dead. The political order has survivors. Recognition has occurred. Cordelia and Lear have found one another. None of it reaches the body in his arms.
This is where it becomes tempting to say that the play has refused settlement. And it has. But we need to be exact about what that means. It does not mean that nothing happens after Cordelia dies. There are survivors, commands, obligations, exhausted people trying to decide what must now be done.
Nor does it mean that grief cancels the public world. The state is damaged. It has to be carried on by somebody. That is one reason the final scene is so cruel. Public continuation becomes visible at precisely the moment when private recognition has become unbearable.
There is a phrase in the final scene about the gored state. It is not an abstract state, not merely a body politic. It is a political order imagined as wounded, bleeding, and still somehow required to survive.
And the Dead March does not convert survival into consolation. It gives grief a public form without telling us that the form has repaired anything.
This is also where the two surviving early texts make a precise difference. Our declared folio-based reading has Lear say, "Do you see this? Look on her. Look, her lips. Look there, and gives Edgar the final command to speak what we feel.
In Quarto 1, Lear's final sequence instead includes the cry, "Oh, oh, oh, oh," and the last speech is assigned to Albany. The difference is not a riddle we can solve by announcing one witness more authentic than the other.
For this episode, we follow the folio because its final attention to Cordelia's body and Edgar's command to the survivors are doing specific work in our argument. But the quarto reminds us that neither that attention nor that final speaker can be treated as a neutral, universal ending.
The original ending gives us a control case. Recognition, punishment, grief, and surviving rule are all present. They still cannot agree on what has been repaired.
I resist the idea that Tate can be described by one sentence. He gives us a happy ending. If the problem were only a final emotional blow, that description would be enough.
The correctives have each arrived. None has carried the whole burden.
Need cannot settle it, exposure cannot settle it, recognition cannot settle it, punishment cannot settle it. Political survival cannot settle it.
The final scene stages several forms of evidence at once. Lear holds a body. Other characters ask him to look, to speak, to recognize what is there. The body settles one fact and refuses every larger demand placed on it.
But the body matters here as more than failed evidence. Lear's last attention turns outward. He does not return to the division, the crown, or the account of who deserves what. He says of Cordelia, "Do you see this? Look on her. Look, her lips. Look there. Look there."
It is a command to share attention, not a successful test. He keeps asking others to witness the body because he cannot make its life return by witnessing it himself.
And after Lear is gone, Edgar gives the survivors a different command. "The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say."
That does not repair Cordelia. It gives the living an obligation of speech after repair has failed.
Lear's last recognition is not a recovered sovereignty or a completed moral lesson. It is an agonized recognition that this particular body, Cordelia's body, cannot be absorbed into the arguments about punishment, succession, or public survival that still crowd the stage.
Political survival is not a reward handed to the innocent. It is an exhausted obligation assigned to survivors. The final command to carry the ruined state forward is not a restoration scene.
The gored state matters here. It joins public continuation to bodily injury. The order that survives remains wounded, and the people who survive have to act inside that wound.
To save Cordelia, a dramatist must change what those things can do in relation to one another.
Tate's work is much more serious than emotional aspirin.
There is another crisis in the final scene. Lear keeps trying to test Cordelia's life through sight and hearing, as though perception itself might reverse the fact before him. Seeing becomes an act of desperation, not a reliable procedure.
And that desperation dictates any later adaptation. A repair cannot merely punish Edmund harder or give the survivors a more efficient government. It has to decide whether knowledge can arrive before the body becomes proof that knowledge was late.
In Shakespeare, the plot keeps showing us the cost of arriving late. Lear recognizes that Cordelia's refusal was love and asks her forgiveness only after he has divided the kingdom and surrendered authority to Goneril and Regan. By the prison sequence, that knowledge cannot secure a rescue in time. Gloucester recognizes that Edgar has been faithful only after he has trusted Edmund's calumny, driven Edgar into exile, and been blinded and cast out.
Their recognitions illuminate the damage. Neither makes the conditions that produced it disappear. The surviving order can name the wreckage, but cannot make knowledge retroactive. The final catastrophe is not simply a dark conclusion stapled onto an earlier play. It is where the earlier terms return in their most concentrated form: speech, evidence, obligation, need, exposure, punishment, and a public future that survives private loss.
Nahum Tate's History of King Lear begins by telling us that it is revived with alterations, but the most consequential alteration is not hidden. In his dedication, Tate says he has found an expedient to correct what was wanting in the regularity and probability of the tale.
The expedient is a love relation between Edgar and Cordelia. That sounds, if one says it too quickly, like the part everyone would like to skip over.
A very long way to go for a wedding invitation.
But it changes the causal field from the first act. In Tate, Cordelia's reserve can be connected to rank, courtship, and an attachment that has already appeared. Edgar's relation to her gives his later movements a different pressure. Tate even says that this turns poor Tom from a merely life-saving shift into a generous renunciation.
The adaptation has not yet saved anybody. It has changed what acts can mean.
Tate does not keep Shakespeare's action intact and lower a rope into the final scene. He rebuilds roots between love, knowledge, intervention, survival, and succession. Cordelia has a larger active role. She is not held at a distance until the action needs a French force and a reunion. She searches for Lear. She meets Edgar. She becomes part of the action through which help might arrive.
The play also supplies mechanisms that make danger legible and actionable. Evidence is intercepted. Villainy can be brought into public view. Edgar can meet Edmund in formal combat. Lear can fight the executioners before Cordelia is killed.
Recognition, in other words, can become intervention. In Shakespeare, recognition arrives with a devastating delay. In Tate, knowledge crosses the distance to rescue.
This changes politics as well as feeling. The final arrangement can become imaginable because action, evidence, courage, and reward have been placed in a sequence that can produce a future.
Notice what has happened to delay. In Shakespeare, the action makes us live through the interval in which understanding comes too late. In Tate, delay becomes something the revised plot can manage. A message reaches its destination. A disguise becomes useful. A challenge arrives before the execution is completed.
That does not make Tate's world frictionless. It makes timing legible as an ethical problem. If rescue is possible, characters have to receive knowledge, believe it, act on it, and arrive before the body becomes only evidence of loss.
This is my interpretation of the adaptation structure, not Tate's declared political theory. But Tate's own final action gives that reading concrete form. A captain enters with Cordelia under a death order. Edgar arrives in time and says, "My dear Cordelia, lucky was the minute of our approach." The chains come off before the body becomes the proof that rescue was late.
Then, the last movement makes public evidence answerable to that rescue. Albany produces the paper that exposes Edmund's design. Lear asks, "Is't possible?" And the restored order is announced before it is imagined as a future.
We must phrase that carefully. Tate does not enact a completed coronation or wedding. Lear declares that Cordelia then shall be a queen. The Edgar-Cordelia relation points toward a future union. Lear imagines retirement with Cordelia and Kent, while Edgar's final moral says that truth and virtue shall at last succeed.
Perspective forms. A future promised rather than a kingdom calmly administered before our eyes.
The future matters. It gives suffering a horizon. The danger has not vanished, but Tate lets the action move from peril to rescue, from injury to judgment, from loss to a form of public continuation.
I agree that the route matters, but I want to resist one temptation in our own argument. Tate's care travels through exceptional mechanisms: an intercepted letter, a disguise, a duel, a captain, a king's declaration. Does that really show us care becoming ordinary, or only good plotting becoming merciful?
Fair. I was making Tate sound more transferable than he is. His world does not abolish the need for exceptional acts. It concentrates them and makes them arrive in time.
Then the political value is not that Tate supplies a program. It is that he makes responsibility visible as a chain. Somebody must know, believe, move, and be authorized to intervene.
Tate is a counterworld, not a policy solution. He shows the original ending's negative lens by reversing it. Compassion cannot act merely because it is felt. It needs roots, witnesses, and authority.
Which also means the repair has a cost. It turns the catastrophe into a world where the right people can become effective. Shakespeare keeps asking what happens when they cannot.
And neither description gets to call itself morally pure. A repaired ending can acknowledge responsibility to an audience. An unrepaired ending can register what repair would falsify. The work is to see the mechanics, not to award points for suffering longer.
Tate's removal of the fool belongs to this difference as well. The fool's pressure on Lear's authority and his companionship through exposure are not simply carried over unchanged. Tate is arranging a different economy of guidance, danger, and emotional accompaniment.
The warning is useful. Adaptation is not a list of additions. What looks like subtraction can redistribute who sees, who speaks, who accompanies, and who has to carry the play's knowledge. Tate's altered action changes not only outcomes, but the path by which an audience inhabits them. Samuel Johnson is the critic who makes it impossible to pretend that there is one sensible response to Tate and one serious response to Shakespeare.
He begins with a sentence that sounds almost like a distribution of the episode we are having. Lear, he says, keeps the attention so strongly fixed and produces a perpetual tumult of indignation, pity, and hope.
Tumult is important. This is not a critic calmly extracting a lesson. He is describing a feeling at the breaking point.
Yet, Johnson also says that a play in which the wicked prosper and the virtuous miscarry may be good because it represents the common events of human life.
There it is, the concession that must not be edited out. An unjust catastrophe can be artistically valid. It can tell the truth about a world in which virtue does not guarantee survival.
And then he turns. Reasonable beings naturally love justice. He says an ending in which justice is observed does not make a play worse.
The concession is not withdrawn. Another demand enters beside it.
He reports that the public has decided for Cordelia's Tate ending. And he says that Cordelia's death shocked him so much that he did not know whether he had endured rereading the final scenes until he edited the play.
This is not a little confession after the real criticism is done. The confession is the criticism. Johnson is trying to hold together common life, a wish for justice, public preference, and his own endurance as a reader.
He also cannot be made into a simple Tate partisan. He records the view that Tate's alteration loses part of the original tragedy's beauty. He can see what the adaptation answers and what it costs.
This is where I think he becomes much more interesting than our contemporary habit of asking whether an ending is earned. Earned by whom? By plot? By morality? By a body that has had enough? Johnson gives us several answers and lets none of them cancel the others.
The public preference he mentions is historical evidence within a specific critical field. It is not a survey of every audience that has ever encountered Lear.
We do not turn "the public has decided" into an eternal psychology. But it tells us something about the pressure Tate's ending had come to answer. There was a public desire for a Cordelia who retired with victory and felicity. Johnson can report that desire without being able to surrender Shakespeare's Catastrophe.
And he also makes a structural point relevant to our earlier discussion. He says the Edmund action compensates for injury to simplicity through variety and cooperation with the chief design.
Which means even Johnson does not treat unity as a simple test. The secondary plot may trouble simplicity. It may also be part of the work's larger force.
His criticism remains divided because the play remains divided. One can ask art to represent common life, then discover that common life has made a demand on feeling that one cannot simply endure.
There is something generous in refusing to make that contradiction a flaw in Johnson. He is not caught between reason and sentiment because one of them has failed. He is registering that a work can make two valid demands that will not become one verdict.
To say that innocent people die in common life does not tell us what a tragedy should make its audience carry. Representation is not an exemption from judgment.
Equally, the wish for justice is not automatically a demand for a lie. Tate's version asks, what conditions would have to change before justice could become more than a last-minute wish? That is an artistic and political question, not merely an emotional preference. What I do not want to lose by calling Tate a repair is this. A repair is not an admission that Shakespeare was wrong. It is a decision about what a later audience, theater, or critic cannot agree to leave unresolved.
Johnson makes that decision visible by refusing to make it final.
And his refusal has consequences for the word catharsis, which people often place over this discussion like a lid. Johnson never gives us a theory of purgation. He records a tumult and a shock. Those are evidence of a reader's historical encounter with the play, not a diagnosis that the play has failed to release the right emotions.
A later critic, Judah Stampfer, argues in a different direction. Stampfer proposes that the play's tragic effect may release a fear that penance cannot repair a covenant once broken. That is a serious account of why unreconciled catastrophe might still produce an effect rather than simply leave damage.
But it remains Stampfer's modern interpretation, not a secret instruction hidden in Shakespeare. I do not want Cordelia to become the tuition fee for a cosmic lesson about maturity. Johnson keeps another possibility alive. An ending may be powerful, defensible, and still leave a remainder that will not become wisdom.
That remainder is what Tate works on. He does not answer a philosophical question about catharsis. He changes the dramatic conditions under which feeling can become rescue, survival, and a future.
Aristotle enters later, and less tidily than people expect.
In 1715, Louis Theobald says that Shakespeare's plays lie under errors because he was unacquainted with the rules of Aristotle. That is an extraordinary sentence to open a discussion of Lear.
But Theobald does not then perform a clean 3 unities inspection and throw the play away. He turns immediately to the propriety of Lear's character, the force of a person who remains recognizably himself while falling apart.
The rule is present. So is an experience that exceeds the rule.
Theobald also worries about the relation between the Lear story and the Edmund action. The safest way to put his point is that he regards the secondary action as only loosely dependent on the main fable under a strict regularity test.
And Joseph Warton, writing later, makes the unity objection more directly. He argues that Edmund's plot pulls attention away from Lear's action and weakens the unity of the fable.
But Warton does not name Aristotle in his Lear essays, and he is not dismissing a broken machine. He praises madness, storm, broken speech, and the final scenes. He is trying to explain why a play he finds overwhelming also seems to pull in too many directions.
Better question. Does Lear obey rules? The additional plot gives another father, another child cast out, another body exposed to power. It disperses the action. It also makes the family disaster impossible to keep inside one royal household.
Aristotle's poetics complicates the later critics rather than giving them a verdict. Aristotle does not use poetic justice as a rule that the innocent must survive. His preferred tragic plot moves in one unhappy direction. He ranks the morally gratifying double plot below it.
Aristotle cannot simply command Tate's ending. But he does help us see why later readers were struggling to separate moral satisfaction from tragic force.
I am tempted to say that rule language is what an anxious reader reaches for when too many injuries refuse to fit one moral. Theobald wants form because feeling has exceeded him.
Perhaps. But that risks psychologizing away a formal problem. If a second action disperses attention, changes the weight of scenes, and delays recognition, those are consequences in a play, not merely symptoms in a critic.
You are right. I was treating form as a defensive vocabulary. The form can make a real demand on us. What has to connect for one catastrophe to be intelligible?
And I should revise my resistance too. A formal demand is never pure geometry here. Theobald's character, Warton's fable, Johnson's justice. Each rule arrives where someone finds the play's pressure hard to carry.
Rule language is neither a villain nor a diagnosis. It is a contested attempt to decide whether feeling, action, and consequence have been gathered into a world.
And form answers back. A plot can gather experience, distribute attention, delay recognition, make a rescue plausible, or prevent it. The argument about unity is never only an argument about tidiness.
It is an argument about how many kinds of suffering a tragedy can make us hold at once, and whether holding them together produces a world, a wound, or a demand for another version. The argument changes again in the 19th century, but it does so because Tate has long been the familiar English theatrical Lear. By the time Charles Lamb writes in 1811, the happy ending version is not a marginal alternative. It is the stage inheritance against which Shakespeare's Catastrophe has to be argued.
There is a further historical complication. In 1810, every version of Lear had been kept off the English stage out of deference to King George III's illness. Productions returned after his death in 1820, still in Tate's version.
Tate's theatrical dominance would run for more than a century and a half before William Charles Macready's Covent Garden production restored Shakespeare's tragic ending and The Fool in 1838. Lamb's question reopens between two histories, a theater long habituated to Tate's rescue, and a reading culture that can insist that the catastrophe means something the stage has found difficult to bear.
Lamb's answer is almost physically uncomfortable. On stage, he says, Lear becomes an old man in the rain, someone we want to take into shelter. Reading gives us something else, a mind whose scale the body cannot display.
This is the claim people keep attributing to Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It belongs to Lamb. And the distinction matters because Lamb is not offering neutral production history. He is making a romantic argument about imagination, embodiment, and reading.
He also attacks Tate's love scenes and happy ending. For Lamb, they make the work easier to lead around theatrically.
But I want to take one step further. And this is my reading, not Lamb's factual account of Tate's intentions.
Then say so. That distinction does some work.
A stage distributes weighting among bodies. You watch exposure. You hear the storm. You measure the distance between a person and the door that may not open. That can make the wish for rescue immediate in a way a reader's imaginative identification does not.
Which helps explain why Tate's alterations have theatrical consequences without making them a mere concession to a stupid audience. His action gives knowledge a route into intervention. It makes danger visible, answerable, and potentially recoverable.
He changes the timing. Reception can arrive in time to do something.
The claim is powerful. It must remain yours, not Tate's declared theory.
Agreed. Tate tells us about regularity and probability. I am saying that his rebuilt action also changes the temporal distance between knowing and saving.
Then, A.C. Bradley reframes Johnson's distress again. Bradley dislikes Tate's Edgar-Cordelia marriage and its confident moral, but he refuses to ridicule the wish beneath it.
When he judges Lear as strict drama, he wants Lear and Cordelia to live, not because he cannot bear pain, but because he thinks the tragic emotions have already been sufficiently stirred and that the final catastrophe does not seem adequately motivated by the action.
It is a severe claim. We do not have to accept it, but it translates Johnson's shock into a question of dramatic satisfaction. What has the plot earned, and what does it still demand?
Bradley does not then hand Tate the victory. Beyond strict drama, he finds in Shakespeare's ending another kind of poetic magnitude. The sudden catastrophe belongs to a wider imaginative force that a well-made plot or a stage performance may not fully contain.
He moves the tribunal. We are no longer asking only whether justice arrives. We are asking whether we judge the work as drama, where causality and motivation matter in one way, or as poetic imagination, where the final blow may exceed what plot can justify.
And this is where I have to confess a bad readerly impulse. I can feel the temptation to say, I prefer the unbearable ending, therefore I am sophisticated.
An impulse that has ruined many seminars.
It is not an attractive one. Because if Shakespeare's pain alone proves depth, endurance becomes a cultural status test. But if Tate is merely sentimental, we pretend that bodies in time, visible danger, and a future after suffering do not make serious claims on us.
Bradley makes the conflict sharper without resolving it. Tate gives a dramatic future because he builds one. Shakespeare withholds it, and that withholding may create a magnitude that is not the same as satisfaction.
I do not want to finish by making Stampfer the final answer. I still want the Folio's body and residue to remain on the table. Lear asking us to look. Edgar asking survivors to speak what they feel. And no repair declared complete.
And I still need Tate's future on the other table. Not because I think it cancels the body, but because a daughter who can be saved, a king who can retire, and a public order that can promise something afterward make a claim Shakespeare refuses to make.
Then neither version is innocent. The Folio asks us to carry a remainder that no moral account can absorb. Tate asks what must change before compassion reaches a body in time.
I cannot call Tate a cancellation. He does not erase the catastrophe from the history of the play. He stages the conditions under which another ending could have happened.
And I cannot call Shakespeare more profound merely because the loss is harder to endure. That is the bad readerly prestige I was trying to resist.
We leave the two books open. One does not teach us to enjoy suffering. The other does not let us pretend that a future promise repairs every wound.
At the table, that is perhaps where we began. You wanted to know whether the ending gave us somewhere to put the feeling. I wanted to know whether giving it somewhere to go might make us stop looking at what has been lost.
Now we know that both questions belong to the work, and neither gets the last word.
We began with two endings and a small domestic disagreement about closing a book. I still do not think a question is which Lear is better.
Nor whether suffering proves seriousness, or rescue proves weakness.
The question is this: when a work makes private speech carry public value, then lets every repair fail, what do later readers owe the feeling it leaves behind?
And when an adaptation rebuilds love, action, evidence, survival, and succession, so that feeling can travel toward a future, what has it saved? And what has it changed?
Perhaps that is why neither book should be closed too quickly.
I am Bear. This is Critical Animal. If I got under your skin, good. Subscribe and bring me to your next dinner party. See you next time.